Hi, everyone. Welcome to lecture guide number 10 on abstract expressionism. So before we get started today, this is a lecture in which we're going to be talking about a stylistic movement in the United States that really got going during the Second World War and immediately afterwards. And it's of particular importance in the history of art in that this is the first time on a kind of international stage that American painting is seen as being at the forefront of all art that's being produced in the world at this time. And the reason for that is not only that these were extraordinarily gifted artists, but they were championed by a particularly persuasive critic by the name of Clement Greenberg, who was able to argue that these artists of the middle of the century were producing the most advanced form of modern painting that had ever been produced, one whose roots go all the way back, if you remember our story, all the way back to painters like Edouard Manet, who started these moves towards producing paintings that took into account the strengths and the limitations of the medium of painting, that tried to reduce painting to its essential characteristics so as to make it stronger at what it was best capable of doing. So our story today, we're going to be talking about two major artists, Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko, but we're also going to be talking about the form of art criticism that supported these artists and in some ways informed what they were up to. I mean, they were definitely interested in the ideas that Greenberg put forward. And remember, you've got a reading from Clement Greenberg's own criticism, a kind of recap of what he had been writing for years, called Modernist Painting, that you should have already read before you enter into this lecture. To get to these artists, though, let's kind of take a step back in time. Start here going back to Cubism and Picasso's Ma Jolie, this analytic Cubist work. And the reason I wanted to start here is to say that, remember, and this will be a question that you may find on an exam coming up, modernist painting, modernist sculpture is preoccupied with a couple of questions. We've been covering this a lot in this class, but it's time to kind of recap that and really note some of the main moves. So first of all, we said that modernism is a historical moment in which every discipline, every kind of activity, particularly in the cultural realm, is searching for those components of past traditions that are still relevant to the present, and getting rid of anything that is seen as no longer important to the present moment, right? So you carefully sort through past traditions and you say, hey, these types of subjects are important now. This type of mode of making art is important now, and this is why. Now, within that interest, that kind of broad interest in the modernist moment, within painting, which has been our exemplar all the way through the quarter, painters were really interested in the question as well of what is the essence of painting? What is it at its very basic, most elemental level? What separates it from all of the other art forms? And perhaps most importantly, what can it do that nothing else can do, and how can it do it? And so, for instance, we saw Edouard Manet saying, hey, painting, before it's anything else, is a two-dimensional surface covered by pigment. And if I want to be honest or truthful to the medium of painting, I need to kind of make everyone aware of that two-dimensional quality. And so Edouard Manet's work, as we said, looks very flat. It draws attention to the surface of the painting itself. It makes us aware of the tactile qualities of paint, its material properties, and so forth. Because as I said when we were talking about Manet, those components, things like line and color and shape and the application of paint by brushstroke and so forth, are pleasing in and of themselves, regardless of whether they represent something else in the world like a figure or a landscape or a still life or what have you. We then went forward and we looked at a number of artists of the post-impressionist moment, and Impressionism as well, that are trying to figure out how to draw attention to the formal qualities of painting. And in Impressionism, right, we talked about how a little dot of color might be a visual painterly analog of the play of light dancing off of a leaf or something like that. So you don't try to hide the fact that it's paint on the canvas. You just try to find a correspondence between that brushstroke and the play of light in a particular place in the world during a particular kind of atmospheric effect. We also said that in the post-impressionist moment, you start to have the rise of painting being thought of as being expressive. So if you were to say that Manet's work is about kind of the formal qualities of paint and just drawing attention to the pleasure that comes from that, when we get to Expressionism as a mode of painting, the logic is a little bit different. It's that paint can, through the effects of the formal elements, the way that color or line or texture or spatial composition impacts us as a viewer. And remember, these are the essential qualities of painting. Before it's anything else, it's these formal visual elements. That in Expressionism, these formal or visual elements can impact us and express a message better than, or perhaps a better way to put this is more in line with the essence of painting than, for instance, representing something accurately. So an example of this would be, for instance, we were looking at Edvard Munch's work or Vincent van Gogh's work. Instead of representing the world accurately or representing someone with a sad face or just representing people dancing in order to express joy, you would use particular types of lines, particular types of colors and their combination, particular textures, particular spatial compositions in order to express the feeling or kind of general content, the thing that you're trying to express, whatever that might be. You're trying to express that through the formal visual elements rather than creating something that looks like something in the real world that we would associate with those emotions. Excuse me. So, for example, in order to represent sadness, if I were a classical painter, I would show someone with a sad face. Yes, I would be interested in the form elements too, but they wouldn't be the thing that I was really focused on. If I were a modern painter, though, in order to represent sadness, I might use descending lines, lots of monochromatic, kind of deep tone values that are understood to be depressive, maybe in combination with things that are associative, like a sad scene of a woman crying, such as Edvard Munch's Death in the Sick Room. So Expressionism starts to assert itself, and remember, this is very modern because the painters are saying, at basis, my art is about the form elements of painting, and if I am going to be a true modernist, I need to use those form elements to communicate my message rather than things that are associated with things in the real world. So Expressionism comes around. Then we also have something that is very in line with Manet and the issue of trying to represent pleasure through the form elements of art. When you have artists particularly interested in those arguments put forward by Clive Bell and Roger Fry, that say that painting is, or art is at its basis, something that inspires an aesthetic emotion, an emotion that can be only caused by the form or visual elements of painting or sculpture or whatever your art form might be. And those form elements and their combination in such a way as to produce an aesthetic emotion is something that Clive Bell and Roger Fry called significant form. We call this formalist art criticism, and it's basically saying that it is totally okay for a painter to just focus on abstract formal relationships of color, line, shape, and space and so forth, because that is what art is at its very basic level. The combination of this significant form in such a way as to produce an aesthetic emotion. And a lot of artists like this. Most perfect example of this might be Henri Matisse's work, such as The Joy of Life, that's all about pleasure and beautiful, vibrant colors and arabesquing lines and their combination. Now, most artists are kind of partially in between all of those things, such as Picasso here in Majoli, who is wanting to deconstruct the old classical ways that painting created an illusion of three-dimensional space. And remember, as I said in the lecture earlier on, he's taking things like converging lines and perspective and modeling and basically messing it up so that it doesn't work in his painting. But what he generates is a type of space that we call optical space, a space that's basically a kind of optical phenomena in which we see space, in this case about a 2-inch space, of different tilting planes intersecting with one another. And that optical space is something that Picasso thought, and all the formalist critics, all the way up to Clement Greenberg, who we'll get to later on, thought was very intrinsic or essential to painting. It's the type of space that you can't imagine yourself walking through or existing in. It's a space that is essential to a two-dimensional surface covered with different pigments and different lines and so forth. That in place, thinking of these different reasons that artists are moving away from accurate representations of things towards greater and greater degrees of abstraction. Remember, when we were in the United States in our last lecture, we said that a lot of modern artists were trying to adopt the strategies of the Europeans, but they were running into various problems, not getting support, American public thinking that American art should be about American values and American subject matter, and that abstraction was European. Well, the abstract expressionist artists actually were, the best way to put it is it's almost like they were students or just, very young artists during the 1930s when regionalism, which we covered last lecture, was so important. And remember, again, regionalism, American subject matter, American values, created and represented in a very representational form that everyone could understand. Regionalism is usually thought of as kind of the opposite of modern painting. So these painters are working in the 1930s, many of them as part of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, working in the Federal Arts Project, and, regionalism is all around them. So they're looking at that, and they're wondering how they can adopt those forms into their art. But they're not really satisfied with that because they're very ambitious artists who want to be modern. They want to be, at the forefront of advanced painting. But they don't really have the support in America, so they kind of, I would say they try on different styles, but they're really not kind of excited about it at this stage. Something changes, though, in the late 1930s into the 40s that helps to support modern art in the United States and basically brings the abstract expressionist painters, people that we'll be covering today, into close contact with the most advanced European artist of their day, and that, of course, is World War II. So that's the story I want to tell you briefly here before we get into Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko and how their art was championed by the great critic Clement Greenberg. In Europe, in the 1930s, of course, Hitler rises to power in Germany. Fascism develops in Italy and in Spain as well. And, by 1937, Hitler has consolidated a great deal of power in Germany and is starting to be aggressive towards his neighbors. Now, Hitler, some of you may know, really liked the arts, but his support was only for classical types of arts. He thought all modern art was the product of degenerate racial makeup, and it could even degenerate anyone who looked at this art form. Degenerate is a big word for the Nazis and Hitler. Some of you know this. Of course, the the Nazis and Nazi Germany promoted the idea that there was one kind of perfect race, the Aryan race, and a lot of really degenerate races, such as the Jews and the Gypsies and the mentally insane. And then, of course, they tried to exterminate all of those degenerate races so that it wouldn't mix with the more pure races and bring society down to a degenerate level. Well, they also thought that modern art was being produced primarily by these degenerate races. And again, that if you went and you looked at modern art, it could somehow degenerate you, like we saw in those cartoons about the Armory show in New York in 1913. The logic is kind of similar, unfortunately. Well, in order to promote the right kind of culture in Germany and to show everyone what the Nazis thought was the wrong kind of art that was to be avoided and to be stamped out and to be destroyed, along with, of course, the races that supposedly produced this. Hitler staged a series of exhibitions over the next 4 or 5 years called the Degenerate Art Exhibitions, or the Entartete Kunst exhibitions. And in this, early on, what he did is he basically took all of the modern art out of German museums as he began to, ship the Jews off to concentration camps. He stole their art collections and put those works of art in the degenerate art shows. It's a little bit hypocritical, I should say this right now, in that he also sold a lot of this modern art behind the scenes to make money for the German war machine. But in any case, he staged these big exhibitions, and they were a huge success in Germany because they were so scandalous. Huge amounts of people lined up, as you see here, in front of the degenerate art exhibitions and attended them. And when they went in, what they would find are works of art produced by many artists that you've already seen in this class. This is the Dada Wall, and it says up above, you can see this is not a nice way to display art. Art was oftentimes hung askew, accompanied by this kind of graffiti scrawl, exhibition titling, such as here. They call themselves the Dadaist, as if they're artists. Artworks by very adept modern masters was hung side by side with works by children and the clinically insane, or by works by primitive cultures, which were seen by Hitler as being at a lower evolutionary stage in humanity. In other words, he showed this art, but only to show how bad it was and how it was the product of these degenerate racial makeups. Is standing in front of the Dada Wall, and now you see that George Gross work has been hung askew, and there's a Vasily Kandinsky on the right-hand side. Well, the art that he liked and that the Nazis liked was very classical art, very traditional art. The term Third Reich actually refers to the idea that the current Nazi regime was the third in a long line of classically inclined cultural moments, starting with Charlemagne most of the time, or sometimes, when it fit the Nazi agenda, they would say the First Reich was the Roman Empire. They were just a continuation of the Roman Empire. Art like this, which I just find really horrible and awful. This is a work by a Nazi championed painter on the Four Seasons. So very classically nude forms with, personifications up in the sky above it. Now, the reason I bring that up is to say that if you are a modern artist in Europe at this time, in the 1930s, things get pretty rough for you. First of all, when the wars began in the later 30s and all the way through the 40s, obviously art's not the first thing on everyone's mind during a world war. It's pretty hard to make a living. It's pretty hard to be producing your art, right? So you don't want to be in this war-torn Europe. But the other reason is that the Nazis were specifically targeting modern art. And as they took over most of Western Europe, these modern artists were, sometimes trying to escape with their lives, certainly not having anyone to paint for. Even very prominent German artists who were card-carrying Nazis, frankly, but happened to be modernists, couldn't get jobs, had their collections taken from them by the Nazis. So there's this mass exodus of artists from Europe who come to the United States, and the place that they end up is in Manhattan primarily, in New York, which is, the cultural center of the United States at this point. And the main characters who came, and you're looking at a picture here on the screen of some of those major artists who came, were ex-Dada and Surrealist artists who were, this was the main thing going on in Europe at this time. So this is a picture of some of the most important artists of their day, and I'll just, if you follow my cursor, in the center, this is André Breton, the leader of Surrealism. This is Max Ernst over here. This is Marcel Duchamp up here, and Richter down here, and many, many other important artists came to New York. Now imagine you're a young American artist, and you've been kind of trying to toe the regionalist line and create regionalist pictures, or you're, fighting for a living in the Federal Arts Project. And now, suddenly surrounding you are all of these great artists you've heard about and you've been interested in showing up in New York right around you. This gives a shot in the arm to the abstract expressionist artists who began to play around with some of the major ideas, particularly of surrealism, in their own art, and move towards greater and greater degrees of abstraction. The main thing, of course, this is another picture just of the surrealists, all the surrealists in New York at this time. The main thing, though, that supports them is that a number of art venues also open up that were very supportive of art. The woman you see in this picture is Peggy Guggenheim, who returned from Europe and started a gallery called the Art of this Century Gallery. The man who's next to her is Max Ernst, the surrealist painter who she was married to for a while. And she supported these artists by buying their works and giving them a venue to show their works. Both the European expatriates, those who had come to New York, as well as these very young, emerging abstract expressionist artists. This is Peggy Guggenheim, for instance, with in front of one of his paintings. She gave him his first one-person show, and she also supported him in a very important moment in his life where he makes his breakthrough to his famous drip paintings. There were other venues as well, the Betty Parsons Gallery. There were numerous shows that were put on during this time. MoMA put on a show called Dada, Surrealism, and Fantastic Art in the late 30s. And Julian Levy, who is a Parisian gallerist, opened a gallery in New York. So in other words, you have this new explosion of modernism in the United States, and these young artists are impacted by that. Major strategy or technique that the abstract expressionist artists such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko borrowed from the surrealists was psychic automatism, or automatic drawing. Remember, trying to tap into your unconscious and allow the contents of your unconscious, and for the surrealists, it's the contents of their id, to show themselves in the automatic, non-controlled movements of your hand across the surface of a canvas. So remember here in André Masson's work called Ariadne's Thread, he painted that brick red field in the background. He stared at this for however long, a couple of hours, and then just once he felt like he was in tune with his id, he just started letting his hand doodle whatever it wanted to, and this was supposed to reproduce the contents of his unconscious, bring them to consciousness so that you could fuse it with the rational mind and create this surreality. That was important to the abstract expressionists. They loved this idea of tapping into the collective or to the unconscious, but they had a major problem with the surrealist, and that's that all of the abstract expressionist artists, I think it's fair to say that, at least the ones that we're covering today, were very much interested in reproducing content, reproducing ideas in their art that would be socially useful to society. So this is number one in the goals of abstract expressionism in a general way. All abstract expressionist artists, to some degree, were interested in saying something in their art that would be beneficial to humanity. They had all been, they're all Americans. They come out of the regionalist movement where the idea of content or meaning in art is very important. They want to create works of art that are going to be socially useful by bringing up profound human conflicts or desires, just like the Surrealists. The problem with Surrealism, though, is that they thought that the Surrealists, by tapping into their personal unconscious, right, just the contents of their own unconscious, were just reproducing things that would only be primarily beneficial to that individual artist. Like here, let's say Andre Masson paints the scene, maybe he's got an issue with women and maybe someone else does as well, but this is particular to the contents of Andre Masson's own personal unconscious. This is where we get to why the Surrealists adopted automatic drawing or psychic automatism, but instead of trying to tap into their personal unconscious, they got really interested in another psychoanalytic thinker, a follower of Freud by the name of Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung became very popular in the 30s in the art crowds. He talked about art quite a bit. He was a psychoanalyst, but he's best known, I think, in the art communities as someone who talked about comparative religions and the ways that these comparative religions have all of these similarities despite never having come into contact with one another. So stick with me here. If you've ever studied different religions around the globe, you will know that some of the main components of each religion, even though they have many differences, are very much the same. So you might find elements of Buddhist society and the idea of nirvana very similar to Christian ideas about heaven. Or you might find in the Greek myths and all of their stories of their religion the same moral lessons being taught that you find in Norse mythology or that you find in South America. And these cultures didn't necessarily exchange ideas directly. So Carl Jung is looking at this phenomenon and he's thinking, well, how does this occur that all of these different disparate cultures throughout history over the course of thousands of years keep saying many of the same things in their religions, keep kind of pointing out some of the major profound human conflicts and aspirations and goals and drives and so forth? What Carl Jung thought was that, unlike Freud, our unconscious is not only a personal unconscious, the repository of all our deep-seated anxieties and desires, but it also had a component to it that he called the collective unconscious. Now, for Jung, the collective unconscious is something all humans have, that they all share to some degree, that they're born into the world with, and they've always been born into the world with since prehistoric times. And in the collective unconscious, there are what he called mythic archetypes. And these archetypes are, for instance, the anima, which is the feminine component of a man in his unconscious that, for instance, teaches him to see women in a particular way, to desire them and fear them in a particular way, or the animus, which is the masculine side of a woman who, inversely teaches her to think about men in a particular way and so forth. They're almost like little psychic lenses or mediators that you're born into the world with, and they're in your unconscious, but they're teaching you to think the world a particular way. Or another way to put this is just to simply say, all of us share in common a collective unconscious, as well as our personal unconscious. The collective unconscious is something that is a repository of the most profound components of being human, what we desire to do, how we act in the world. Now think about this for a minute. If you're an abstract expressionist artist, and you are wanting an art form or art that is useful to humanity, and you think that the surrealists are just kind of producing contents that are in line with their own personal, individual unconscious rather than something that's collectively useful, then Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious becomes really persuasive. Because what if you could, instead of tapping into the personal unconscious like the surrealists did, what if you could tap into the collective unconscious and bring out from the collective unconscious different imagery or abstract forms that would induce other viewers to, to see the contents of their own collective unconscious? I know this is really abstract and it's really difficult to follow these ideas, but it's just like this. If the most profound components of humanity are unconscious, our drives, our aspirations, our fears, our longings, if those are actually in a component of our unconscious that is collective, then if you could tap into that and create a painting that is based upon the collective unconscious, it could bring everyone else into contact with those profoundly human drives and emotions, and that would be useful. So the abstract expressionist artist basically replaced the interest that the surrealists had in the personal unconscious with an interest in the collective unconscious, so that they use psychic automatism and automatic drawing in order to tap into the collective unconscious. This is part of the second goal as well of the abstract expressionist. Number one, profoundly human content. Number two, content that would be universal to humanity in a universal language. This is where that interest in modern painting, in the idea that color and line and shape and form could impact us directly in an expressionistic way. Speaking of painting as a universal language, right? We don't need to know any conventions to understand abstract form. We just are impacted by particular lines and shapes and colors and their combination. That is something that the abstract expressionists adopted as well, and it's a long component of modern painting. Remember what this means. If you, for instance, take the color of red to mean love because you've seen it on Valentine's Day hearts, that's a convention. It's something that you learned. If, however, red impacts you on a kind of psychological level to make you feel impassioned, that's the way that the surrealist and the abstract expressionist and many other modern artists thought of painting as working. The actual perceptual effects of color and line and shape are almost a universal language. So that's number two of their goals. Their third goal is very modernist, and these are all mutually inclusive goals. They intersect with one another. The last goal is to create paintings, because we're going to just be looking at the painters, that follow the logic or the essence of painting. That very modernist idea of producing a painting that impacts us only through its formal qualities. Now, that last goal is the thing that Clement Greenberg, the critic, really cared about. He didn't care about content. He didn't care about the collective unconscious. He championed these artists because he believed they were at the forefront of all modern art, getting rid of anything inessential to painting and only using painting to inspire an aesthetic emotion. I'm going to pause here for a minute. I'll be right back. So the first painter that we'll be looking at of the abstract expressionist movement is Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock is most well known for his drip paintings, which we'll see in a few moments here. But he started off his career in a very representational style, which you see here. This is a work from the early 30s when he is working for the Federal Arts Project called Going West. Right, it's a Western scene. It's using some, he's definitely drawing attention to abstract qualities of paint, but he's still very representational in his form, meaning you can recognize horses and wagons and a figure and buildings and a sky and so forth. He's actually being taught for a brief point in his career by Thomas Hart Benton, for instance. But then in the 1930s, later on in the 1930s, when these European expatriates start showing up in New York, he gets more and more inclined towards modernism. And it's right around the same time period that Jackson Pollock actually seeks out help. He had a number of psychological issues going on for him, probably exacerbated by the fact that he was a raging alcoholic for most of his life. He gets the advice from one of his friends, and at this point he's very interested in Carl Jung's ideas, as many of the American artists were. He gets the advice from one of his friends to seek out a Jungian psychoanalyst, and meet with him to discuss some of his psychological issues. Now, this Jungian psychologist apparently decided that the best way to work with Jackson Pollock was for Jackson Pollock to create drawings based upon his collective unconscious, right? Try to tap into his collective unconscious and create drawings from that. And then they would bring these drawings in and talk about them together and what they meant and so forth. So in the later 30s, this starts in 37, he is deeply immersed in Jungian psychoanalytic theory and ideas about the collective unconscious. And he begins to start using those in his art. This is, again, before Jackson Pollock makes what we call his breakthrough move towards complete abstraction. He produces works like this, and pretty much all of the abstract expressionist artists go through this stage where they're abstract, but they're still using representational form or symbolism in their art to express their ideas, rather than just using the formal qualities of paint to express their ideas. The work you see here is called Male and Female from 1942. And it's a work that's based upon these Jungian mythic archetypes, the contents of the collective unconscious, the anima and the animus, the feminine side of the man and the masculine side of women. In Jungian psychology, and you don't need to know this inside and out, there's always this kind of duality set up between opposing forces that for a good psyche to develop has to be integrated. And that's what this work is really about, kind of integrating these two different sides of humanity together, the masculine and the feminine. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but what I do want to say is that when you look at this painting, on the left-hand side is the feminine, right? And the reason we can tell this is that he's using conventional symbols to represent femininity. These aren't completely abstract yet. He's using, for instance, big, bright eyes with big eyelashes, because we all know women have big, beautiful eyes, right? And he's showing breasts, and he's showing the reproductive kind of interior organs of a feminine. All the female form over here is kind of soft and curvy. Whereas here, over on the masculine side, we've got, instead of soft, curvy forms, we have a bunch of numbers, as if, rational language of mathematics is more associated with men. That's a convention, of course. We have more hard lines, kind of rectilinear forms here, which are associated with men. And then in the middle, these diamond forms, which are symbolic of unification or integration of the opposites. My point in showing you this painting is to say that at this stage, while Jackson Pollock is very interested in the first two goals of abstract expressionism, trying to create content or meaning in his works of art that will be useful to all of humanity, in this case, the contents of his collective unconscious. And number two, that he's starting to think about creating a universal language of form through this. He still hasn't quite gotten there yet, and he certainly hasn't taken account of number three completely, because these are still symbols, they're still conventions, they're not just communicating the collective unconscious through abstract form. And he'll do this over and over again. This is another example of Pollock's early career work called Guardians of the Secret. Guardians of the Secret, again, it looks incredibly abstract, but the more you look at it, the more you start seeing figures. There's a figure on the left, and on the right over here, kind of the guardians of this altar. It looks like an altar in the center, a ritual space, covered with pictographs, things that look like, an abstract language. Down below, you see a coyote down here. And up above, you see mask forms taken from various Native American cultures. Pollock, just like those European modernists, was very interested in what he called primitive cultures and their closeness to the real components of being a human, kind of the deep-seated, profound components of being a human. And he studied a lot of Native American art here and put it into his own work. For instance, the wolf or the coyote at the bottom is a very prominent symbol in Native American cultures. It's what we call a trickster figure. It's a figure that's able to move between the material world in which we all live to a spiritual realm outside of it and bring back knowledge from the spiritual realm. It's an emblem, in a way, of what the abstract expressionists were trying to do, going into the spiritual realm of the collective unconscious and taking form out of that and reproducing it in their paintings. He even put up here on top a Sonequa mask. Some of you may know this. The Sonequa figure is kind of the scary old lady of the woods in Kwakwaka'wakw culture, a Northwest Coast culture, that, for instance, natives used to scare their children into eating their vegetables or something like that. He's just kind of piled all these things up in here. Or work. Jung talked all the time, as did Freud, about how Greek mythology was really basically narratives reproduced in order to help us deal with big human problems, big human issues. And this one's called Pasiphae from 1943, which is, the title refers to the myth of the Minotaur. Remember the Minotaur from Surrealist works. And it's the same idea, right? This semi-abstract form, but still has figuration in it. Where I want to get, though, here is to his mature artistic form. In the middle of the 40s, Jackson Pollock, who suffered from drinking and various kinds of psychotic events, was given a stipend, a monthly allowance by Peggy Guggenheim, and set up in a kind of country home in New York, outside of the city, where he could just devote himself to his art. And he was married, you should know, to a very famous abstract expressionist woman artist, Lee Krasner, who put her career on hold so as to help Jackson Pollock attain his greatest achievements. And so they went to New York, outside of the city, and he made his breakthrough move. Now, that breakthrough move led to these types of paintings. This is number one from 1948. It's a painting that is completely abstract now. And the way that it is produced, and these are huge works of art, by the way, the way that it's produced is that Jackson Pollock would lay unprimed canvas down on the ground. And then he would put himself into a state that's very similar to what the Surrealists called psychic automatism, right? Very meditative state. And then he would try to paint just using gestures and drips of paint on the canvas, all different kinds of paint, that would reproduce the contents of his collective unconscious. Or to put this another way, he'd put himself into this deeply relaxed state, allow the contents of his collective unconscious to be kind of boiling around in his head, and then when he felt compelled, just like Andre Masson before him, he would just start dripping his paintings all over his paint all over the canvas on the floor, with the idea being that these abstract relations of color and line and shape and form would, when a viewer looked at them, express the contents of his collective unconscious and therefore fulfill the three requirements or the three goals that abstract expressionists had: profoundly human content, reproduced in a form, a language that was universal, just abstract form, and also, because these things have no figuration, no symbolism, no conventional meanings, be in line with the third goal, which is to create something that is essential to painting, that follows the logic of painting in its two-dimensional emphasis. As Pollock once said, quote, "When I am in my painting, I have no fears about making changes, destroying the image, etc., because the painting has a life of its own. When I lose contact with the painting, the result is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony, easy give and take, and the painting comes out well." And in the same passage later on, he says, "The content of all my, or the source of all of my paintings is the unconscious." So here are a few images of this process that he used to create these paintings, right? Them out, putting himself into a deeply relaxed state, and then doing this kind of dance around the sides in which, just like Surrealist psychic automatism, allowing your hand to move freely in response to the contents, in this case, of his collective unconscious, he would produce these paintings. go back to this one then. In these paintings, what you're supposed to be seeing then, on the one hand, are all of these abstract forms intermingling that when you stand in front of it would express the same feelings that Pollock had in relation to his collective unconscious. Now it's completely abstract though, so the way that it's communicating that message or expressing that message is just through color and line and shape and spatial organization. Because they are completely flat and reproduce what was called a optical space, a space that just exists for the eye rather than one that you can walk through, they were seen as being in line with the third goal of abstract expressionism, which is to follow the logic or essence of painting. And this is where Clement Greenberg really liked these works, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So here he is kind of admiring his work after he's, partway through it. Another work by Jackson Pollock called Autumn Rhythm number 30 from 1950. Again, these are huge paintings, sometimes as much as 25 feet across and 10 plus feet tall, that totally envelop you when you stand in front of them. They're just kind of coming from everywhere, that are meant to express the inner contents of his collective unconscious. Jackson Pollock, who you see here off to the right, was a personal friend of Clement Greenberg, who you see, second from the left here. The far left is Lee Krasner, and in between the two is Helen Frankenthaler, another member of the abstract expressionist circle. Now, Clement Greenberg loved these works because, as I've said or briefly mentioned before, he thought they were the most advanced form of modern painting, or a painting that had reduced painting to its essentials and didn't have any components to it that pointed outside of itself. He is someone who is a formalist art critic. He was once called the Archduke of Formalism. He follows the logic of people like Clive Bell and Roger Fry, in that he thinks the essence of all art is its ability to produce for us an aesthetic emotion that is conjured up or created by significant form. So he only cares about that component of painting. And what he thinks is that if you were to go back and look at someone like Edouard Manet, you have the first step towards getting rid of components of painting that are not intrinsic to painting, right? Manet had made things flatter, more two-dimensional, emphasized the surface of painting, its integrity of the picture plane, the revolution of the color patch, and all of those terms we've covered earlier on. And then you have people like Cezanne that takes it a little bit further, and then people like Picasso who takes it a little bit further even more. What he said was that the abstract expressionists have pushed painting as far as it can go at this stage towards the essence of painting. So what did he mean by this? Well, the famous quote that is in the article that I gave you is, quote, "The essence," and this is what Greenberg said, quote, "the essence of modernism lies, as I see it, in the use of the characteristic methods of a discipline, in this case painting, to criticize the discipline itself, but not in order to subvert it, but to entrench it more firmly in its area of competence." So what is he saying? He's saying something that we already have heard a number of times in this class. Painting needs to focus in on what is its essence, what is its basic building block, which is form, which is line and color and shape and spatial organization. And the better it can do this and get rid of anything that is inessential to painting, the stronger it will be, the more competent it will be. And he was such a persuasive arguer of this logic and was such a champion of the abstract expressionism that he convinced a lot of people that the abstract expressionists were the most advanced painters in the world of their time. Here's one more work by Jackson Pollock called Blue Poles, in which what I'm going to try to do is explain to you some of the things that Clement Greenberg thought were essential to painting. Number one, in that essay, Clement Greenberg says the essence of painting is its flatness, its two-dimensionality. It is, after all, paint on a two-dimensional surface, and all painting, in order to be truthful to painting, needs to draw attention to that fact. It's two-dimensionality. That's the starting point. Number two, painting is visual. And so the space generated by a painting should be a space that is intrinsic to painting, just optical space, as he called it, space that exists for the eye, but not a space you can imagine walking through or being in. It's a space that is basically a kind of optical illusion or optical play of line and shape and color and so forth. And this painting is that. It doesn't refer to anything outside of itself. Number three, Clement Greenberg once pointed out that in abstract expressionist works, the composition itself, the way that you compose line and shape and color and so forth, is always responsive to what he called the literal support of the canvas, by which he just simply meant if a canvas is rectilinear, if you create a focal point, as a classical artist would do, and say, look here first, this is the most important part, and then look here second, and so forth, you are doing something that is inessential to painting, because painting as a rectilinear field is a field. It doesn't have a specific focal point, and so your painting should take that into account, that it is a field. And in this case, where is the focal point? You look all over the surface of the painting, and that's what Clement Greenberg called all-over compositions, or later in a different place, he called the polyphonic field, a multiple kind of frequency field of different areas of interest. These are just three of the ways that Clement Greenberg would point to abstract expressionism and say, look at how this painting is essential, right? Look at how it's all about form. Look at how it doesn't point to anything outside of itself. It is intrinsic to painting itself. Now, Greenberg didn't care at all about content or the collective unconscious. He only cared about the ability of a painting to reproduce this aesthetic emotion. He didn't call it an aesthetic emotion, by the way. He called it quality, but he meant the same thing. In that when we stand in front of it, we feel the quality of this painting, its aesthetic capabilities, and that, remember, the logic is the more essential a painting is, the more it is about the basic building blocks of painting, the more likely it is to produce a very strong aesthetic emotion. Now, Jackson Pollock he started drinking again. He kind of lost his nerve, and he moved back and forth between his mature drip style to these types of forms. And then eventually he will actually die in an automobile accident while drinking. But at this stage of his career, I just wanted to show you this. He moves back towards things that are very surrealist. This is called Portrait and a Dream. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of a human being, it looks like, very similar to that portrait of André Breton by André Masson. And then on the left-hand side, you see what looks like an automatic drawing. That could be an André Masson work. So you see how they are so interested in surrealism. This type of painting and abstract expressionism, and Pollock's only one example of many other painters that were doing it, is what we call gestural abstract expressionism, meaning it looks like it's produced by the gesture of a hand. Now I want to move on, though. Oh, I'm sorry, a couple more pictures. Clement Greenberg was so popular and so persuasive as a critic that many of his ideas began to gain kind of popular art forms. This is Jackson Pollock, a spread in Life magazine, where the question is Jackson Pollock the greatest living painter in the United States? And, you know, brings up many of Clement Greenberg's ideas to push this idea that this is the greatest painting in the world at the time. It became so popular, it becomes, you know, the backdrop of fashion models during the time. A form of abstract expressionism is what we call color field abstract expressionism, and I'm going to use Mark Rothko, the man on the left-hand side of this picture, to be my example of color field abstract expressionism. Mark Rothko went through the same kind of trajectory as did Pollock. Early in the 30s, he's producing very figurative forms such as this, called the subway scene. It's very modernist in the sense that he's picked a subject about social alienation and people living underground here by having to travel through the subway. And, you know, this is part of the stage in which Mark Rothko, just like Pollock, is playing around with ideas in regionalism. Later, 30s, early 40s, like Pollock went through this stage. Mark Rothko keeps creating paintings that are based upon Greek mythology and the collective unconscious, but they're still very figurative. This is a work called Antigone, based upon Greek mythology. He's very caught up in the trilogy of Aeschylus. You don't need to know that, frankly, for this class. But he's trying to create forms that are, again, going to represent the contents of his collective unconscious, but he's still using figuration, right? We see here in the Omen of the Eagle, their work of art that looks like it's not the same as Pollock's, of course, but it looks like it's indebted to the same ideas. There's still figuration, there's still symbolism. It's based upon a very well-known Greek myth. So he hasn't quite gotten to the stage of complete abstraction yet. He, like Pollock, in the mid-50s, begins to produce works of art that look like this. This is a work that is called Ochre Red on Red from 1955 that was produced in a way very similar to Pollock's way of painting. Although Mark Rothko didn't lay his canvases on the ground, he would set these up on the wall and he'd stand in front of them or be on a ladder in front of them, and he would lightly stain the surface of the canvas with very diluted oil painting so that the oil painting actually seeps into the canvas and stains it and produces these really evocative abstract paintings. Now again, Mark Rothko was thinking in terms of trying to represent or evoke or express profound human emotions through painting. Now these emotions, he doesn't want to give them a title like this is joy, because those emotions are things that are much more subtle or much more profound than the words we give to them. Joy, there are a million different types of joy. Here he might be representing one little nuanced feeling of joy through his paintings. Just like Pollock, he would put himself into a fairly meditative state and for days at a time live in the studio producing these paintings. Now, Clement Greenberg loved these as well because he thought, wow, unlike a Pollock painting where you can still see one kind of drip of paint over another drip of paint that creates its own kind of 3D element to it, Mark Rothko's paint is literally stained onto the canvas. You can't get any more two-dimensional or flat than this. So Greenberg thought, wow, this is even more advanced than Pollock in its modernism. Another one of these by Mark Rothko is called Green, Red on Orange. And again, if you just stare at this for a while and just allow your mind to wander, you might get some of the expressive content that he's trying to get to. The best way I know how to explain, though, the real complexities of abstract expressionism and Mark Rothko's work is to finish off by looking at the monumental series of work that he did for the Rothko Chapel. Now, the Rothko Chapel, which you see in the background behind this sculpture by another abstract expressionist, Barnett Newman, called the Broken Obelisk, was a chapel that was designed for the very paintings that you're going to be seeing. It's based upon an experience that Rothko had while in Europe, touring various cathedrals and little chapels. And what happened was that he started thinking about the things that he was seeing in all of these churches. And I think, you'll be able to kind of think your way through this. If you think of Christian religion as, instead of as being true, as being instead the way that humans have made a narrative or made a belief system that helps them to think about what is important in their lives and what things that they don't like in their lives, and to basically deal with profound human questions, then what Rothko is after here is to take things that are, let's say, a part of Christianity and things that are part of Buddhism and things that are part of philosophy, and express them through the abstract form of painting rather than the conventional language of religion, like there's a God and there's heaven and so forth. So he made this chapel, and it's a chapel that's based upon some of the earliest forms of Christian chapels, what are called central plans, with 8 walls on them, and then he filled these walls with these paintings. This is what I mean by, what he would have come in contact with in Europe, and what he is trying to move away from representational form towards abstraction. Specifically, what you're looking at here is the apse painting in a little chapel in Torcello, Italy, called Santa Maria Assunta. And the apse space in a church is right behind the altar where the major rituals of Christianity take place. It has its own standard symbolism to it. Here, the half dome shape is symbolic of heaven, as is the gold leaf that creates most of that gold there. So that's heaven. The Virgin Mary here is holding the Christ child in her hand. That is a symbol for Christians of transcendence, of promise. In other words, what this represents to Christians is that Christ was born so as to allow us all the possibility of getting into heaven by sacrificing himself on the cross and creating a kind of new covenant with mankind. Now, the specifics of the Christian language aren't important, but of course, you wouldn't know any of this unless you knew about Christian symbolism, right? It's not a universal language. You have to know the conventions of Christian symbolism. But in this case, when Rothko saw this, he thought, wow, this Christian symbolism is all about transcendence. That's our key word for this component, transcendence, meaning getting beyond the earthly realm, getting beyond the phenomenal realm in which we all live, and even more importantly, getting beyond the facticity that all of us are one day going to die. This is a big human profound aspiration. It shows up in just about every religion. It's based upon the fact that we're all only going to live a very short time. And so religion comes along and says, wow, that's a deep, profound human fear that your existence is only a little blip in historical time. And so religions create narratives or stories that say, but, here in Christianity, Christ was born so that you get to go to heaven and live forever, thus transcending the limitations of your earthly life. This scene is all about that promise, and it's all put in very conventional Christian symbolism. When you get ready to leave a cathedral or a chapel, oftentimes on the entrance wall, which is also the exit wall, you see scenes like this. This is the Last Judgment scene. And for Christians, at the end of time, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse come and wipe away humanity, and then Christ returns to judge you all on the basis of your nature, whether you're good Christians or bad sinners, and those who are good get drawn into heaven, and those who are bad get cast down into hell for all time. Again, a very conventional narrative story. Based upon, again, the fact that we're all going to die. And so this represents the fact that you're going to die. One day you will die, and you either go up into heaven or you are cast down into hell. Now, what Rothko thought is that these 2 poles, what he called the imminence of our death and the longing for transcendence, are 2 poles which humanity constantly lives in between. Or another way to put this is to say that all of us, whether you're religious or not, or whatever your religion might be, have to deal with the fact in the back of your mind, deep in your profound unconscious, that you are going to die one day. And that most of us are all longing for ways to transcend the fact that our life is finite, that it's going to end. And we may do that by adopting a particular religion or a particular philosophy. We may do it by having children so as to continue our progeny. We may do it by trying to make a mark on the world, write a amazing book that people will read long after our death or what have you. But for Rothko, this was kind of the fundamental, profound human predicament. We're all going to die, and we all long for something more. The problem was that the Christian symbolism wasn't universal. It was particular to symbolism used by Christians. Rothko Chapel, he tries to put you into a situation in which you would contemplate or feel these two poles, the imminence of your death and the longing for transcendence. This is a pretty bad picture, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the Rothko Chapel and how the paintings are set up. Much more like what the Rothko Chapel looks like in terms of the color of the paintings, but it doesn't give you a very good sense of scale. These are the paintings that you see right when you walk in. They're on the same space that the apse wall painting of the Virgin and Child would be in a traditional Christian chapel or cathedral. And when you look at these things, they're a quite different type of painting than what you see on the side walls. These are paintings that are about 12 to 14 feet tall, these deeply modulated, meaning slightly shifting fields of color that when you get up close to them totally envelop your view. And because they're so modulated, I mean, they look a little bit like, here in the Northwest, if you look off into the distance and it's raining and you see those sheets of rain kind of coming off, miles and miles away, they look a little bit like that. And your eye can't focus on them, so they create this kind of cloud-like effect. When you get up close to them, and I have spent, 100 hours in the Rothko Chapel. I went to school in Houston for a while, so I've been there quite a bit. When you get up close to these paintings and you stand within, let's say, a foot of them, you can't see anything else but this kind of deep purple. And within a couple of seconds, that color starts to literally breathe. It looks like it's moving back and forth and creating these cloud forms, so much so that you wonder if the surface of the canvas is really moving. Now, the effect of this is it's really exhilarating. It feels like you're kind of caught up in this cloud. You feel kind of weightless. For Rothko, this was the feeling of transcendence, of going beyond your earthly realm, going beyond your own individuality and the short span of your life, and being caught up in the all. Being, in Christian terms, this would be being a part of God, being a part of everything around you. In various Native American terms, this is about recognizing the fact that we're all interrelated and interconnected. And in front of this painting, it really evokes that feeling. It makes you feel weightless. It makes you feel transcendent. But as you're looking at this painting, out of the corner of your eye, on the side walls of this chapel, you see another type of painting that looks like this. And pretty soon, that thing keeps nagging at you, and you have to go over and look at it. But the effect of this one is exactly the opposite. The effect of this one is when you stand in front of it, it doesn't move at all. It feels like death. It feels like an impenetrable wall. You actually can feel the weight in your feet as you stand in front of this thing. It's not very pleasant or joyful at all, and you can see out of the corner of your eye all these other paintings, right? The earlier transcendent paintings, and you want to return to that transcendence. So in other words, what Rothko is doing is he's setting up a situation in front of you. You have this experience of transcendence that's in totally abstract painted form, right? It's a universal language of abstract form filled with profound human content in that universal language. That's all about this human predicament of longing for transcendence, but of course being caught up in the fact that we're all going to die. Greenberg loved it for one reason and one reason only. These were the most advanced, essential forms of painting. But Rothko, who didn't mind the support of Greenberg, at least in that it helped make him famous, really didn't like the idea that his paintings were just about formal plays of color and line and shape, or primarily color, because he wanted his works to be expressive. They had to evoke or express profound human emotions. So he once said, and he was implicitly responding to Clement Greenberg, "I'm not interested in relations of color or form or anything else. I'm interested in only expressing the basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. And the fact that lots of people break down and cry when confronted by my pictures show that I communicate with those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. And if you, as you say, are moved only by their color relationships, then you missed the point." Well, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture and gained a little bit of knowledge of abstract expressionism and I'll see you again soon.